Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our MetaChat this afternoon. Really glad that you are all here joining us. And if it's your first time, welcome. A few of you have joined our previous chats. We say welcome back to you. And it'd be great to have those of you on the call just in the chat very quickly. Tell me where you're dialing in from. Of course, at MetaMap, we try to be thought leaders and engage in current and important conversations. And that's what we're going to do today. Our topic, as you have seen on our posters, is how AI can increase efficiency of transaction monitoring and due diligence. Of course, talking about the power of AI and transforming how we do work as we manage the risks that we face in financial services with fraud and crime, and of course, trying to comply with regulation. So today, we'll spend some time digging deep in those conversations, again, looking at how AI can do what it says it can do and how we can adapt and plan and implement those solutions in our various businesses. So, like we don't like to waste time. We're going to go straight into it. And like I was saying earlier, our topic is driven out of what is going on currently. Of course, there's been a lot of talk about AI across various industries. I think recently I was hearing about in Hollywood and the strikes with the writers and actors, again, about the studios and the use of AI. There's been a lot of talk about AI in some negative colors, but again, we're looking at the positives of AI, how it can again help increase our efficiency, manage regulatory obligations, and the cost of compliance. And again, looking how we can better enhance customer experience as it relates to your onboarding, to your maintenance of your relationships, but also trying to manage your efficiency altogether. I think one key thing to look at as it relates to the markets, again, with Africa, with Nigeria, is the volume of transactions that currently happen. I think I'm looking at some data, and as at 2022, Nigeria was about, I think, sixth ranked in terms of the volume of transactions at 5.2 billion transactions. That was behind India, China, Taiwan, South Korea, I believe. And in 2023, the data suggests that Nigeria, for example, is going to go up to about 8 or 9 billion transactions. So imagine the volume of transactions that goes through the system and how those need to be monitored because regulations are very clear about doing that. If I think about Nigeria, again, using as an example, with the recent CBN consolidated customer due diligence regulations, there's still that clear need to monitor transactions, but also you see that a lot of compliance teams are struggling with false positives. I think some data also suggests that in terms of false positives for transactions, you find that about 1 to 2% of all transactions are deemed to be suspicious. However, about 15% of transactions are flagged as suspicious. So again, this tells you the big gap between the truly suspicious transactions and those that are deemed to be by our current rules-based system, and the amount of work you have to go through to see through those that are truly suspicious and require actions or reporting and those that are not. So again, back to the point about how AI can help drive this conversation to improve efficiency, to reduce the labor, the man hours that you take in dealing with false positive transactions, but more importantly, to allow your compliance team focus on more important activities like training, like reporting, like being able to monitor better and train your staff members better to manage your internal and external obligations as it relates to policies, frameworks, and regulations. So again, we're going to dig deep into this conversation. So we welcome every one of you from around the world. Thank you for joining us. And as you have seen on the flyer, I will not be doing this alone. MetaMap, of course, we work with various partners and various friends around the world, and our friends at Hawk AI would be part of this conversation. I'd like to introduce Natalie. Natalie, welcome. We're going to do this together and dig deep in this important topic. So I'll let you introduce yourself very quickly.
Yes, hi everyone. Super excited to be here today. My name is Natalie Schleitz. I'm a product specialist at Hawk AI. And I've already been with the company or with the team for more than 2 years. So have seen the entire development of the product and obviously also the impact we see of our AI. in the area of compliance. And I'm super happy to join the discussion today here.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And we'll go right into it. So, of course, talking about the AI-powered automation of transaction monitoring, I'd like to start with that, right? Because we'll talk on customer due diligence a bit later. But like I said earlier in my introduction, right, there's been the huge increase in the volume of transactions globally in Africa. And of course, there's been a drive to do more digitally. So financial inclusion, mobile penetration, all those things are fueling the use of digital devices for transactions. Of course, there are strict regulations. Even FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, also speaks to the fact that AI is important and help you better assess, but also predict, right? Challenges that may come through these transactions. So, what are your thoughts as it relates to just AI being used to drive transaction monitoring?
Yeah, so when we speak of like AI powered transaction monitoring, we, as you just said, it's a key topic, and that is one of the latest innovations in anti-financial crime. And ultimately, how does that work? AI models take large volumes of financial data. They're able to analyze everything, and they're able to operate also in real time. And by doing that, they can really help to, on the one hand, detect and identify suspicious transaction patterns, bigger networks. They can create profiles, for example, of expected behavior, and do something like a very smart peer group review. So match it against similar customers, match it against customers, the customer's history. And by doing that, it's much more intelligent. It's much more flexible compared to, let's say, proven or traditional rule-based approaches, because it's constantly evolving. And that is what you were just mentioned, the angle of detecting or helping with true positives as the AI to really increase the rates and have more relevant cases appearing for the analyst or for the compliance department. But we also see AI really, especially in the area of transaction monitoring, but also sanction screening, that it helps a lot to increase the efficiency of teams. And by doing false positive reduction alerts, using existing patterns, or using very common patterns, like, for example, if you send money to another country, but to a family member, that are alerts that might be frequently popping up, but where AI can help to intelligently close patterns like these, or learn just from decisions that have previously been made, because there's a huge amount of data from these decisions and from the workflows even that can be used to inform these AI models. And I think the great thing about most of machine learning models is really that they improve by feedback. So you can increase training loops, you can have feedback from analysts and from operators, constantly feeding the model with new input, and essentially help fine-tune the model to your own circumstances and to your very specific situation. And by helping that, you really develop a very bespoke approach to compliance. You can really go ahead to your regulators, to auditors and the like, and have really this bespoke risk model for your own bank. And I think that's something to really incorporate in the future. And this is obviously a lot of benefits. Like I just said, one of the things is real-time decisioning, because AI models are, when deployed correctly, they have the ability to help in real time, and they help also to speed up the whole investigation process and the whole detection process overall, especially when we're talking about AML and fraud. Especially in fraud, you want to detect it as quickly as possible. But also the false positive reduction, the scalability, and the overall more solid compliance, because you, on the one hand, use the AI to increase efficiency, but on the other hand, to also increase what you see and you protect against risks that you might not have on your mind, but where the AI can go have a run through the data and the transaction behavior and by itself raise cases that are anomalous. And so overall, it's a great investment to save teams times, keeps the entire costs low, and safeguards against other risks. And so ultimately also help financial institutions protect their own customers and their own assets.
Thanks, Natalie. You touched on so many great points. I like the points you talked about, and it was about the convergence of AML and fraud management, because there's almost that circular loop, right? Because you can argue that fraud is a predicate offense to money laundering, because you find people that do fraud want to find a way to pass the money they've stolen, right, through the system. So
Exactly.
ultimately, you
Yeah.
need to capture all these data points, right? But I like to expand a bit further, right? I like what you mentioned about the models being able to learn from what you do, because of course, one of the fears people have is that AI is going to take away people's jobs, but that is not true, like we know, right? But there's elements of what the human still does, right? Humans will still be required because there's the regulatory element you need to fulfill. In Nigeria, for example, where I'm based, you find that your central bank will perform your audits and review your processes, your procedures. I also want to talk to people, because the question is, what are the rules you're using? How are you monitoring? Is it auditable? Are you able to enhance? Are you able to um, kind of walk backwards? Because you don't want a situation where you have unforeseen issues because of a model, right? So maybe to that point about being able to train the model with your current decisions, right? For those who have concerns to say, would AI completely take over every single part of the process? Would humans be involved, or would humans be necessary in the conversation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So of course. So what I always say is AI is a tool that we use, and that humans use. And you need to be able to use it properly. So you need to understand and you need to have full explainability. And explainability comes from actually two angles. So on the one hand, the angle that you see let's say in daily life. So when a case is, for example, brought up by the AI. And it needs to be brought up to you, to a human, to reflect, because the AI currently is used as a first layer to help manage the false positives, but also on the other hand to really bring up the case and be more a virtual teammate that does the pre-work for you. But the human ultimately needs to be able to understand this pre-work done by the AI, so that the human can ultimately investigate further, create more relationships, and perform this task. And the human element is always the last layer, and the AI is the efficiency and effectiveness increase. And for that, explainability needs to be there. So you need to exactly understand in human readable language, so no coding language or anything, but you need to have a factor, for example, that says, this case is suspicious for this reason. Number one, what I believe is, for example, it's very unusual. This transaction amount is like 600% higher than it usually is, and the like. And it should be like a prioritized list of factors, so that the human can actually understand and then put this further. I think this is the number one where the human needs to be involved. And the second thing is, because it is a tool, we also need to feed it and guide it and tailor it to specific financial institutions and financial and situations, and the financial approach to fighting financial crime. So, for example, the topic of model governance is what I'm touching upon here, is very essential. And in saying, like, these are, for example, on the one hand, the use cases I want to cover, and I need to document which factors would I give to the AI. So which data am I feeding the AI with exactly? What are maybe specific fraud or AML patterns that need to be considered, where I want to maybe have a very bespoke model only to detect this very complicated pattern, like maybe a fan-in model. And all of this needs to be properly documented, which data this is included, what version is there, what did I change in which version, and this is the, let's say, background data science part that needs to be very thoroughly done to ultimately have the regulator also on your side to say, hey, I'm using AI, but I'm using it in a very ethical and very responsible manner. And if you want to, you can have a look on the visualization, how exactly and which factors we include in that.
Great points. I guess there you have it. Humans are still required in this process. Absolutely. So I like your point you mentioned about governance and ethics and just being able to demonstrate that the framework complies with existing regulations. And of course, it's auditable, right? And I guess before we obviously get to the point about transaction monitoring and actually transactions, there has to be onboarding, right? And part of the onboarding process as required by regulations is your due diligence, right? Of course, in many climes, people complain about the ease of onboarding. Of course, we know the risks of poor onboarding, particularly as it relates to identity and false identities or false information. That's why you have to verify other things. Of course, we know the issues around shell companies have been able to identify the ultimate beneficial owners. Of course, we understand the regulatory requirements around classifying your clients into high, medium, and low risk. There's also the elements about PEPs, sanctioned individuals. All those should be picked or addressed the points of onboarding. Of course, you're required to do your continuous due diligence to update information where things change, but you have to get it right the first point, right? Again, we know that AI can help here. So as it relates to one, initial due diligence for onboarding, and then continuous due diligence, how do you think AI can help, one, increase efficiency, manage some of the challenges that we currently face, but also helps to define your risk profile for each client even better than we have them today?
Yeah, exactly. So if we talk, you touched upon, for example, the sanctions and PEP screening, and also including adverse media in that, because exactly in the adverse media part, AI is where it gets really interesting, because AI can help to sort the relevant versus the non-relevant items. So, for example, on obviously learning how contextual some information is very important, and that's where AI can help in the adverse media part. But also on the name matching algorithms used. That's where most sanction and PEP false positive alerts come from, is the name matching. So using AI to intelligently match that to cross-reference with other data points of the customer already available in the financial institution's database is really one point where AI can help. Another point is really as you just said, creating risk profiles. So helping to really do this peer group comparison, to put them into a relevant peer group, which means not only by the normal master data that you have, but by the actual transaction behavior, because also within traditional groups, you can have just different behaviors, and to find these nuances would require a lot of human input, while the AI does it more or less intuitively, as long as you give it some guiding parameters. And also in the topic of fraud and, for example, account takeover. I mean, we haven't touched that yet, but they're detecting anomalous behavior and see if accounts of customers have been taken over, because suddenly we see a very different transaction pattern compared to the history of that customer. And all of that obviously in real time, so that the customer ultimately is not suffering the losses in that sense. And when you talk about also continuous due diligence, it's so important to combine the input you see from the transaction behavior of this customer into those risk profiles. So as I said, in the transaction monitoring, you can use AI to detect anomalies. So is this abnormal compared to the customer's normal behavior? And using this information and then saying, hey, for example, for customer ABC, I detected an anomaly, and feeding this into the risk scoring, for example, that we say, hey, automatically we put this customer now into a higher risk class, so that we just have a little bit of sharper monitoring and we have a more intense eye on this. Again, speeds up the whole investigation process. You can detect transaction AML or fraud much quicker, and this ultimately helps the entire due diligence process to just become more robust for the auditor.
Exactly. Very, very great points. I always like to tie everything back to money, right? Because everybody's thinking about costs, benefits, and that's a business conversation. Before I get to that point, I want to encourage you and the audience, if you have questions, on the lower right of your screen, you should see a question icon. So please type in your questions in there. You don't have to wait till we finish the conversation. Please, as the questions come to your mind, and touch on some of these topics, put it in there and we'll try and take as many as possible. So just to engage you again, we have the opportunities to ask questions to myself and to Natalie. So please use the question box to do that. So, like I said, back to dollars and cents, right? Because ultimately, for every business, you need to factor how you're going to make money, how it's going to increase my revenue, or protect my market share, or attract new clients to me. And I think one of our previous minutes, I talked about just the element of trust, right? And building that trust and consistently so. I like the point you talked about accounts takeover. I think over the past couple of days, one of my contacts was hacked. His WhatsApp was hacked, and the person was then asking people for money using his profile. Of course, they tried to let us know, and the person reached out to us. Long story short, a few people fell for that and have sent money to an account that was opened virtually. But to your point, right? Some of these things
Yes.
can, of course, there will always be the human element. That's why we always talk about your IT security, two-factor authentication. All those things will always be necessary, right? But even above that, there are things that you can introduce into your business as it relates to AI, particularly to increase the trust. Think about your customers' feedback to say, my provider was able to alert me on unusual activity. At first, you might think that's stressful, but if you think about the loss that you may be protected from, that is something that can, of course, build trust. Also, the point about real time. I think that's one of the biggest things, right? Because the traditional rules-based system, of course, you have the flags. Like I said, we had data that suggests 93% or 95% of all flags false positive. So imagine the time it takes for a human being to go review each transactions. Of course, you think about the human factor of tiredness and lethargy. Some things are, yeah, I've seen this before, but are you sure it was the exact same thing? Some things are let to go, are let go, but it's not usually real time, right? And you spend time, perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 days after the event to review a transaction. There's, of course, the reporting element that helps to protect the larger ecosystem. So ultimately, if you're thinking about it as a business owner, what is the value for it? For me, the use of AI not only reduces your costs as it relates to efficiency, but also improves the trust that your clients, that your customers, that your ecosystem, right? Because ecosystem also includes other institutions, other banks, other fintechs, because money moves from place to place. If we can trust that Deji, for example, would always flag things, has an advanced system real time, of course, that also improves your brand identity and those nice things that would obviously impact the bottom line. So, Natalie, if I go on quickly, still on this topic and the point about ongoing due diligence, right? I like to talk about the predictive ability, right? Because we talked about how the models can be trained with, of course, decisions that humans make to say, for example, this is fine, this is not fine. That data goes into that model to say, okay, this was a decision that was made. Let's help reduce the false positives. But also, criminals are smart. We know there's a trend. I'm sure they read regulations, right? They know these things. We are really smart. So in some cases, people believe that they are even ahead of the game, which then becomes, how do I proactively protect myself as an institution, protect my clients, and at the end of the day, like I said before, protect my revenue. So how does AI help with that predictive ability? What does it predict? What does it need to predict? And how do you think it really works? So there's there some reliability in the predictions that AI can make as it relates to the risks that we see with money laundering, terrorism financing, and of course, fraud.
Yeah, we have on our side. So what we see with clients of ours when we go into projects together is that they use models that are called anomaly detection. So the anomaly detection is a tool which needs minimal human input. And that means it continuously analyzes data, historical, but it also includes, of course, every input coming in of new data. And it's predictive in a sense that it always outlines, okay, what would be a normal behavior for this customer? For example, like a normal transaction behavior. It would always say, a normal transaction behavior for this customer would be within range A and B. And so the next transaction this customer is doing should be within that range. And in creating this prediction, the AI is able to take into account data from different sources. So it can be, as I earlier mentioned, it can be peer groups, but pure on transaction behavior. It can be peer groups, but purely on let's say, risk profiles or industry peers. It can be just the historical data of the customer or the previous behavior. It can take into account also other data sources that financial institutions have in-house. If we're thinking in the fraud context, where prediction and quickness in real time matters much more compared to AML cases. But if you think of there, we can take into account IP and device data and all of these things. And this model would incorporate this data and essentially create a profile in predicting, hey, this customer should behave in a certain way. And by having this profile, let's say, always there and ready, but of course evolving over time, and making sure that when the customer has a fundamental change in their behavior, that this is also reflected in this profile. This profile always trails with. And every transaction the customer would come in and would do, and every behavior would ultimately be matched to this predictive profile. And so we can much easier and much quicker identify, okay, this is unusual. And sometimes even one transaction is enough to already do that. And I think that's something that we haven't been able to do so far in that speed to detect it with that many data sources in a very intelligent and efficient manner. And I think this is one big part of the predictive part of AI.
Super. I like the example she raised about, of course, own data. If I think about just a simple things things that are now normal, right? You're watching TV, you have suggested movies based on your previous selections or your search history. So some of us, of course, sometimes get worried that your phone is listening to you, but all that is what you just said. Basically, data from different sources, might be your patterns, might be your transactions, to build a profile and predict, right? What is usual or unusual based on that profile that has been created. We have a question already. I think just to encourage more questions, please put that in the question box. And this is linked to this point about predictions. I'll just take it now. And the question says, could you please provide some practical examples on how to make predictions explainable and auditable? Would you suggest using line approach? Thoughts, Matthew?
Yes, of course. So what we do is different things. So the first part is what I would call visualization. So this is one part of. Can you still hear me? Because I think your connection is a little bit.
Okay, I can hear you, but yeah, I should come back up
Okay,
soon.
good.
Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
oh, good. I thought it was me. No, and so what we have here is the visibility and visualization, ultimately for the operator. So we can AI can help create automatically graphs to have, for example, fan in and fan out patterns. And now going to like more into the line approach, what you mentioned is we do also have certain scores and certain feature priorities and feature importance included in this model, in these models as well. That means we have an overall score. What is, for example, the probability that this case is actually full money laundering or fraud. And then we offer, I would also say, go in and have really these features explained, and also the importance of these features and how much they contributed ultimately to the bigger score. So this is the second part. And then also in terms of that explainability, it's important, as I mentioned, on the model governance side, to really have a versioning to again include which data will this model be trained on, what is the version that is currently running, what did you change from version A to version B, and this is how to create ultimately the explainability.
Fantastic. I think, like you rightly said, right, there's still the element of process and procedures, which includes documentation, right? Because like I mentioned before, there's still the element of demonstrating that to your regulators. It has to be documented, it has to be approved, and every version that, of course, is tweaked has to be captured accordingly. So, Natalie, of course, we talked about a couple of great things in terms of onboarding, ongoing diligence, of course, transaction monitoring. But I like to also talk about one key element for various compliance teams, which also includes reporting, right? Because there's elements of dealing with identification of suspicious transactions, of course, where necessary investigating, but there's the reality of reporting. So, how does AI help with reporting? Rightly so, reducing false positives also reduces the effort to report. But are there other ways that one should think about AI enhancing or easing or making your reporting a bit more robust as well? Thinking about real data points that can be captured to create a proper and full picture of such transactions.
Yeah, sure. So looking again at the reporting part and coming now straight from the explainability side, reporting is only enhanced and more useful if the information is more complete, or if the information is just a clearer structure, and the evidence is just much more profound than it previously has been. And that's where AI can help in creating documentation that is easily understood, that includes also a certain, let's say, assessment by a machine, or ultimately also confirmed by the human, but an assessment about how relevant is this factor here, and creating this list of arguments to bring through in these reports. The second thing is the visualization, so helping also the FIU in the end to have a graph, for example, about about this pattern, about the construct, especially if we're talking about really large money laundering cases. We often see networks, and this displaying those networks in a very easy to understand and easy to grasp manner is really, really helpful. So we increase the readability of the reports, we increase the accuracy reports, and we also, through the predictive ability, also help to see also forward-looking. Hey, this might be a problem, so I'm already, let's say, setting up systems internally and preparing internally already for a situation or a potential case that I see upcoming, so I can monitor more closely and make sure that I have the information easily available. And lastly, also in the whole reporting process, AI can help to streamline the workflow by really saving the time and the resources of the investigation teams by this visualization and the like, and really make sure that the reporting process does not take weeks by trying to find all the documents and trying to find all the transactions and all of these things. And I think these are like the two most important parts on that side. Yeah.
Super. And I have a follow-on question on that point, right? Because I remember a couple of years ago, I had to present to one of the boards I was reporting to on, of course, the landscape, the market, and where the risks are, and what you are doing to address those risks. But then talking about the future or predicting based on various data points. So if we think about the rules-based system, right? If you're trying to fine-tune or refine or add new rules based on your understanding of what is going on in the market, what the future holds. I remember when I was trying to do it a couple of years ago, it was a whole project, right? To fine-tune or refine or create new rules. And I'm like, should it be this hard? With AI and the predictive nature and being able to tell you that this is possible or potential to happen because it's happened here, it happened there, we've seen these patterns. How, if you compare both current rules-based system that most people have, and with that in terms of defense and proactively creating new rules or new controls, how do you compare? How does it compare?
Yeah. So what I would really say is, and then combine the best of both worlds, right? So having the rules, because rules, they have been proven over the years, we've been using them, and there's no need to not use them anymore because they are easily understood. And as you said, they are so inherent also in the DNA of financial institutions that it's important to keep them as a very solid base. And then use the AI to just power them and say, okay, I make these rules on the one hand with AI much smarter and more intelligent by adding the false positive reduction. So just closing or putting alerts that an AI or a model identifies as not relevant or less relevant, put them last on the queue, start with the ones that are much more helpful. And so it helps to prioritize alerts ultimately that come from rules automatically, and it helps to give you guidance on that. And the second thing is what you would do is you have AI to detect anomalous behavior. It's more, you can think of it more as a safety net to traditional rules and say, I have my rule set that is now super efficient through false positive reduction, and I take another AI to protect me against where I don't know whether I have a rule or not. So it's really an extension of existing systems and basically a security layer you would add instead of completely replacing them, because the other way around is also much too risky, because you only would rely on an AI that is analyzing transaction data despite the reasoning and the like, but proven rules are usually always a good first start, and add AI to it as a second part.
To mention that point, because this is not to knock down the current rules-based system. The point is to enhance what we have, particularly driven by digital transformation, increased volumes of transactions, and of course, increasing false positives. So the point is, how do I enhance, make better my current rules-based system to drive efficiency, reduce redundancies, of course, eliminates blind spots, like you mentioned, right? There are things that you don't even know, you're known unknowns, right? There's some things you do not know, but AI helps to point those out and helps you with your decision making. It could be that we could stop this entire business line if we find that the risks are too high. That's it. That's some of the outcomes that we hope businesses look out for as it relates to taking this journey. And there's, of course, we talk about AI, we talk about data, right? There's elements of data being fed into the model and analyzing data. How should various entities, institutions, banks, whoever's on the call, think about the quality of data? Because there's, of course, the journey to enhancing your existing rules. How should you start thinking about it?
Yeah, so of course we know what you feed into the model, as you just said, is really important because it not only in terms of the detection quality or the output you see later, but of course also for ethical reasons. See current discussions on on the whole GPT project. So quality data is really important. So as a good like rule of thumb, I would say 6 to 12 months of historical quality data should be available to train AI models for certain specific factors. And so what financial institutions should be aware of is really having the mindset of gathering and preparing also different kinds of data that can be later used to create this holistic and comprehensive picture. So we're talking about historical transaction data, customer information, like other relevant data, like I mentioned like IP data, maybe including even other information that is just sits within, let's say, really the data treasury park, how I like to call it. For me, it's not a data cemetery. It's really a treasury, or a treasure that you can really see. So have a look there, what data is actually available, and then try to locate it, and then have a concept on how to connect it. So that's very important, and that's what we do often with our customers as well, is go with them on this journey to help them. And you can probably also tell a story about that, but like really go on the hunt for this really hidden data, and really make sure to help them also increase the data quality in the future, and really develop a concept of how will this data ultimately be used. And so there are, of course, techniques you can do that help not to increase the quality of data, but deal with outliers, with missing data and the likes. But of course, the sooner banks or financial institutions start on effectively taking this as a lead project and strategically thinking how to locate this data and how to store it and connect it in a very comprehensive database, it of course makes the use of AI ultimately much easier to start with.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. I think you touched on a couple of important points because, like I mentioned earlier, it's about the quality of the data. And it's important that as we're thinking about implementation, because we obviously want this to be beyond a conversation, people need to think about what's next for them, right? So how would you suggest that, following from what you just said, right? Financial institutions think about the implementation, right? Will it be something that's, you talk about 6 to 12 months of quality data that needs to be
Mhm.
available to fit the model? Is that all? Are there other key things to think about? How do I make that journey from moving from or enhancing my current rules-based system? Is it going to be a 6 to 12 month process if I just make sure my data, I go my data treasure hunt, I see what I have in my treasury versus cemetery, and then right, get approvals, document things, and I'm good to go. How should people practically think about moving from where they are to where they need to get to sort of AI for TM and for CDD?
Yeah, what you really see, I think nowadays in the market and financial institutions doing that is the first and the most important thing. What's my vision? What is my goal? And what are ultimately the use cases? Because you can't really see AI as a cure-it-all to just say, okay, I use AI, now suddenly everything will be better. So it's really important to, as AI is there to assist financial crime specialists, it needs to be used correctly and appropriately for the individual financial institution. So it's important that you have the use cases clearly in mind to develop very specialized and dedicated AI models where it's needed. Maybe in some cases it might not be needed at all because it can be somehow dealt with otherwise. But where you want to use AI, you want to use it properly. So you want to have the use cases where investigators need most support to also start a journey at a very critical point for the financial institution, to also go ahead and see that that certain impact and create ultimately organizational buy-in. So I think that's the first part. And then goals and benchmarks. What do you want to actually achieve? How much false positive reduction do you want to have? What's the true positive rate you want to achieve? And I think having this in mind is very important. And what can help in these situations is, for example, a proof of concept. So before doing AI, thinking about it and then say, okay, let's do a test run. I give someone data, and this data, I will train models on this data to just see on a sample, and not in a bigger project, but really in a sample, to test in a kind of a sandbox way what would be the impact and create the foundation, the business case, and then all the likes, and to really have this sandbox environment to test out, but really keep it going before an implementation, to set all the directions straight. And then you need to think of course, also integration with existing systems. So how does the AI work? Will the AI work as with the existing IT infrastructure? Will it be on-premise? Will it work in a cloud environment? Which data sources will ultimately be used? Which databases do we need? And maybe there are use cases where people say, I want this AI to be a layer on top of my existing system, because this would be too big of a project for now, but you want to make use of AI. So I might want to be on a layer of it. So seeing where it exactly integrates is very important. And then the last thing is really the topic of scalability and performance. So if you host it yourself, then you need to see, do I have the right infrastructure to actually have those models operate in real time? And so it's also more of a topic of how do I involve not only the compliance department in this, but really also the IT department in all of this, and how do I get buy-in, let's say, from every side. So it's a really holistic implementation project that goes beyond pure, let's say, installation and double-clicking something to have it run.
Absolutely. I think this reminds me of course, the importance of managing your stakeholders and having a big table, right? Everybody being involved from day one, right? I think that's what's one thing here, where there's that clear vision. And to your point, things around your use cases, things about what we're trying to achieve, and setting all those metrics very clearly is super important. I like the point you mentioned about scalability, because like I mentioned earlier in our conversation, that just the data, right? Like Nigeria, for example, is projected to have about 8 point something billion transactions. So you imagine moving from 5 billion transactions in 2022 to almost double that in just a year. Of course, driven by a number of events in Nigeria. Nigerians on the call remember the issues with cash availability, the shortage that drove the spike in digital transactions. Ultimately, that's so important, right? In terms of being able to scale. I like, of course, linking to my previous point or question around the ease of updating or adapting to changes. What's those kind of things that cleared or said at the beginning? Of course, with AI, those things become a bit easier to manage. Now, another question, I'm mindful of time, and just to check as well for those on the call, please, we have can take one or two questions. So please put your questions up in the question box so we can take them before we end the conversation. But before we get to that, there's always the fear that there might be inadvertent risks that use of AI, or maybe the wrong use of AI, or the uncontrolled risk of AI brings, right? As it relates to, of course, the objective is to protect the institution, protect me and you, right, from being victims of fraud, but also protect the institutions and the country. Because, for example, I know one of the biggest things that countries try to manage is how they are classified in the Financial Action Task Force list. I think that a couple of countries, Nigeria, I think Cameroon and South Africa, have recently added to the grey list, which of course makes it a bit harder because the idea is that as a country, as an institution, as a market, we have relevant processes, controls, and systems in place across all the verticals. So from banking to real estate to every other industry to ensure that you're not seen as a safe haven for fraudulent activity or money laundering or financing terrorism. And that's already work in progress. Most countries have those frameworks. The question people will ask is, if I'm trying to solve that problem, am I creating a new problem inadvertently, right? So what are your thoughts around some of the concerns around the additional risks that AI may bring, right, in terms of implementation or use? Of course, there's data privacy and other key important points. Is it a function of AI itself or a function of the implementation or the policies or the frameworks that govern how AI is implemented?
Yeah, I would clearly go to the latter of your points, and I think I kept mentioning so many times AI, or let's machine learning models. It's a tool that we use, and it's our responsibility to check how we use it. So machine learning has different types of models. So supervised models to unsupervised models. And supervised models are usually typically really well fed with human knowledge and much more guided in the whole process of model development, for example. And using more of this supervised techniques helps to control a lot of that bias. And the second part, of course, the documentation, is how well do I document what the AI is ultimately analyzing? So I'm very clearly stating I'm limiting, let's say, maybe even the pool of where AI is used. Maybe you say in very critical functions, you don't want any AI involved because you feel it's too sensitive data. And then that's fine. You don't need to use AI on or machine learning models on every part. But at the same time, you can control very clearly the data that goes in there. You can clearly define even factors that you want this AI to have a look at. You document the versioning, so you can restore at any point in time any model in case the new model is, for example, crashing or creating some very not relevant alerts. And I think this is really the key to managing this risk, and that's where it comes down to. It's how do we manage this risk? How do I develop the strategies to make sure that I can run, for example, also without AI ultimately, which is like using rules and AI as an enhancer or an augmentation of existing systems. And I think this is the things we should be nowadays looking at. How do I manage an active policy where compliance is getting more data driven and more data analytics driven? And how do I train up my department and my institution and have really cooperate, for example, also with experts on this matter to have really strategic partnerships to managing this risk, to understanding and to really clearly define on which use cases the AI should work on.
Good. Thanks, Natalie. We have two quick questions which we'll take before we wrap up. So I'll just go right into them. So one question is, how is AI programmed? Is it language based, right? And also segue into the second question, where are the client's data stored? Do you have access? Who has access? We kind of touched on those before, but it might be great to just reemphasize those points. So how is AI programmed? Language based? How does it recognize patterns? And also, where is the client data stored? How does access get granted to which teams and things like that?
So yeah, let's start maybe how is the AI programmed. The AI is still is programmed in coding language, but the output of the AI is non-coding language. So and that's how we work. Is you have the data scientists, either you work with partners or maybe if it's even in-house, you have data scientists who have the ability ultimately to communicate and translate requirements coming from the compliance department to a model input. And as long as the model output is documented, you have your, as I said, your employees and data scientists taking care of this. And regarding the who has access to the data, I think this is also a very in-house decision from the financial institutions. So there are possibilities to say, I have the data either on servers in-house and in my own institution, and then AI models with either in-house or external data scientists can have access to it via VPN networks or virtual machines or the like. You can have maybe your own dedicated cloud setup. Maybe you want to start a cloud project and then it's a very secure environment from the cloud. Or like a public cloud would also be an option. So these are the typical three options you would encounter in this. How the model deployment would work is, yes, there would be some form of updates done for sure, while the self-learning part would be ultimately inherited in the code that is installed then on the financial institution's server, public cloud, whatsoever. I hope that answers the questions.
And too, but thank you for that, Natalie. That was really helpful and detailed. So I think it's a great way to kind of just summarize our conversation for today because we are almost out of time. But again, like we said at the beginning of the conversation, looking at the AI-powered automation rather for financial monitoring, also talk about customer diligence at onboarding and ongoing diligence, but also reporting on how AI has a predictive ability, but ultimately all of this is underpinned by the framework, the governance, the quality of the data that the institutions have and are meant to maintain. Because, of course, garbage in, garbage out, right? So ultimately, the point is there are many advantages, including, like we said, reducing your false positive, increasing your efficiency, but also being able to improve the quality of reporting because then you have a bit more data. And in terms of preparing you for implementing new controls, of course, that information is there. But more importantly, like I mentioned already, your on-call institutions need to think about this holistically. It's not a click, download, and install project. It's something that takes a bit more time, a bit more thinking. Of course, a lot of stakeholders internally and in some cases externally that you need to engage. But ultimately, the idea is to commit to this, to one, improve efficiency, but also enhance your value as a company. Like I mentioned before, we're in this to serve clients, right? Also serve clients in a compliant way. So managing the risk that we have with fraud, with AML and CFT type things, we also want to manage the experience that your customers have, right? So starting from your identity verification, starting from how you qualify or risk categorize your clients, and also build your models to drive some predictive or protective measures accordingly. That's summary of what we talked about. I would say a big thank you to everyone who joined us with the questions that came on the chat. Thank you so much. And thank you, Natalie, and everyone
Thank
to Talk
you.
AI for joining us for this meta chat. It's been very enlightening, even for me, to learn more about how AI can make our lives and businesses and customers easier. So once again, we say a big thank you. Just to let you know as well that the recording will be sent to everyone who registered within 24 hours or less. So please look out for the recording in your emails so that at least you can spend some time reviewing a few things that you want to expand upon. And if you want to get in touch with us, I think my colleague has put Natalie and I's LinkedIn links or profiles in the chat. So please, you can reach out to also send an email to Madam Up, and we are able to take the conversations further. So again, thank you for joining. We really appreciate the time. And thank you once again, Natalie, and wish you all the very best of the day and the rest of the week. So once again, thank you for joining our MetaChat, and look out for our announcements for our subsequent MetaChat. So follow us on LinkedIn and register for the next one. And we obviously commit to being thought leaders and will definitely drive interesting and practical conversations for you and your company. So once again, I want to say a big thank you to everyone for joining. Have a wonderful day. Cheers. Bye-bye.